On a quiet February afternoon in coastal Georgia, a young boy vanished within minutes of being last seen. There was no struggle witnessed, no clear direction taken, and no immediate explanation that fit the moment. One moment he was part of the normal rhythm of a neighborhood, and the next he was gone. What followed would draw the attention of an entire city and later a courtroom. But at the start, there were only questions. How does a child disappear so quickly? Who noticed first? What details mattered and which ones would be overlooked? The answers were not obvious, and the urgency was real. Parents across the area paid closer attention to their surroundings, while police faced the pressure of time moving faster than certainty. The case would grow far beyond a local concern, but at the outset, it was defined by confusion and fear, not conclusions. What happened in those early moments shaped everything that followed, even before anyone understood the scale of what was unfolding. Before we continue, if you follow factual reporting on missing persons and solved cases, consider subscribing to stay informed through careful, long-form investigations. Christopher Barrios Jr. was reported missing on February 12, 2007, in Brunswick, Georgia. He was 6 years old. According to documented reports, he had been playing near his home when he failed to return. Family members noticed his absence quickly and contacted authorities. Given his age, law enforcement treated the situation as high risk from the start. Officers responded promptly and began initial checks in the immediate area. Attention focused on nearby streets, yards, and common spaces where a child might wander. Neighbors were asked when they had last seen him and whether anything unusual stood out. At this point, there was no confirmed indication of a crime. The working assumption was that Christopher might still be close by. Search efforts expanded as minutes turned into hours. Patrol units canvassed the neighborhood, while investigators worked to establish a timeline. Officers attempted to determine the last verified sighting and identify anyone who had interacted with Christopher that day. These early steps followed standard missing child procedures, emphasizing speed and coverage. Community response was immediate. Residents joined searches, checking areas that were difficult for police to reach quickly. The sense of urgency spread beyond the block. Word moved fast through Brunswick, and concern escalated as daylight faded without results. Authorities issued public notifications to broaden awareness. Local media reported on the disappearance, sharing Christopher's description and last known location. Tips began coming in, ranging from possible sightings to general concerns. Each tip required evaluation, even as information remained fragmented. Investigators faced a familiar challenge in missing child cases. Early hours are critical, yet evidence is often limited. Without signs of forced removal or witnesses reporting suspicious activity, the investigation relied on elimination and reconstruction. Officers worked to confirm what had not happened as much as what had. As the search continued into the evening, law enforcement expanded the scope. More resources were deployed, including additional personnel and coordinated search patterns. The absence of immediate answers increased concern, but did not yet point toward a specific conclusion. At this stage, the focus remained recovery. There were no named suspects, no charges, and no public indication that a crime had occurred. The situation was still defined as a missing child investigation, guided by urgency rather than accusation. What mattered most in these early hours was time. Every decision, every assumption, and every missed detail carried weight. The actions taken during this period would later be examined closely, but in the moment, the priority was clear. Find Christopher Barrios Jr. and bring him home safely. The disappearance marked the beginning of a case that would soon move beyond a neighborhood search. But at the start, it was a race against uncertainty, driven by concern, procedure, and the hope that answers would come quickly. As night approached in Brunswick, the absence of Christopher Barrios Jr. became more alarming. What began as a neighborhood check expanded into a coordinated search effort led by law enforcement. Officers worked to confirm the last verified sighting and establish a clear timeline. Each minute mattered, and the lack of concrete answers increased pressure on investigators to widen their approach. Search teams moved beyond the immediate area around the child's home. Streets, alleys, wooded patches, and nearby properties were checked methodically. Officers requested permission to look through yards, sheds, and other accessible spaces. The goal was to eliminate possibilities quickly and determine whether Christopher could still be nearby. Local authorities coordinated with additional agencies to increase manpower. Patrol units were reassigned, and command structures were put in place to manage incoming information. The operation shifted from an informal search to a structured response, reflecting the seriousness of a missing child under unexplained circumstances. The community responded with urgency. Residents volunteered to help, forming search groups and distributing themselves across areas identified by police. Parents kept children close while assisting where possible. The collective effort reflected shared concern rather than panic. But the mood was tense as hours passed without progress. Public alerts were issued to broaden awareness beyond the immediate neighborhood. Local media outlets reported the disappearance, providing Christopher's age, clothing description, and last known location. These alerts prompted tips from the public, ranging from possible sightings to general observations. Investigators documented each report and worked to verify credibility. At this stage, the investigation remained focused on finding a missing child, not identifying a suspect. There was no confirmed evidence of abduction or violence. Officers approached the situation by ruling out explanations rather than pursuing accusations. This process required patience and careful documentation. As daylight ended, search efforts continued under artificial lighting. Teams revisited areas already checked during daylight to account for visibility differences. Investigators reviewed the sequence of events leading up to the disappearance, noting gaps or inconsistencies that required follow-up. Law enforcement also began reviewing individuals who had been in the area that day. This step followed standard protocol and did not imply suspicion. The purpose was to establish who had seen Christopher and who might have information, even unintentionally. The lack of immediate results increased concern. In missing child cases, early hours often determine outcomes. The absence of physical evidence made the situation more difficult. Without items left behind or witnesses describing suspicious behavior, the search relied heavily on elimination. Coordination between agencies improved efficiency. Information sharing ensured that tips were not duplicated and that search areas were covered systematically. Investigators worked to balance speed with accuracy, aware that errors early in a case can affect later stages. As the night progressed, law enforcement prepared for the possibility that the search would extend into the following day. Resources were reassessed, and plans were made to maintain coverage. Officers understood that continued effort was essential, even as fatigue set in. Community members remained engaged, but concern deepened. The reality that a young child could vanish so quickly unsettled residents. The search was no longer confined to hope of immediate discovery. It carried the weight of uncertainty. Throughout this period, officials maintained clear communication. Updates were shared as appropriate, emphasizing verified information rather than speculation. This approach aimed to keep the public informed while protecting the integrity of the investigation. The early response reflected urgency, cooperation, and adherence to procedure. It also revealed the limits of action when evidence is scarce. Every step taken during this period would later be examined in detail, but at the time, the focus was singular: locate Christopher Barrios Jr. The search continued into the next phase with heightened seriousness. What had begun as a missing child alert was becoming a case defined by unanswered questions. The community and law enforcement remained aligned in purpose, but the absence of progress signaled that the situation was growing more complex. These early hours established the foundation of the investigation. Decisions made during this time shaped how information was collected, how resources were deployed, and how the case would evolve. The search had not yet yielded answers, but it had revealed the depth of concern and commitment that would follow. The search for Christopher Barrios Jr. entered a critical turning point when investigators located evidence that changed how the disappearance was understood. What had been treated as an urgent missing child case began to move toward a criminal investigation grounded in physical findings rather than absence alone. This shift did not happen suddenly, but through the accumulation of verified information that no longer supported the assumption that Christopher had wandered away. Law enforcement intensified examination of areas near the child's home and locations connected to his last known movements. During these efforts, investigators discovered items linked directly to Christopher. The presence and condition of these items raised immediate concern. They suggested that his disappearance involved outside action rather than accidental separation. Once this evidence was documented, the investigation changed in scope and tone. Officers secured locations connected to the findings and limited access to preserve integrity. Standard missing person procedures gave way to crime scene protocols. Evidence handling became the priority, with careful documentation, collection, and chain of custody established to ensure later legal use. Investigators reassessed earlier assumptions. The timeline was reviewed in detail, focusing on the narrow window between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery of evidence. Attention shifted from broad search coverage to targeted investigative work aimed at determining who had access to Christopher and when. The case was formally reclassified as a homicide investigation. This decision was based on evidence rather than speculation. Authorities communicated this change cautiously, understanding the impact such information has on the community and on the integrity of the case. The reclassification reflected what investigators could support with facts, not conclusions beyond available proof. With this shift came a change in strategy. Detectives began structured interviews with individuals connected to the area and the child's routine. These interviews followed established procedures and focused on corroboration rather than accusation. Investigators sought consistency, opportunity, and verified timelines. Forensic analysis played a growing role. Items recovered were examined for biological and trace evidence. Specialists worked to extract usable information while maintaining strict standards. Each finding was evaluated within context, not isolation. The discovery also affected resource deployment. Specialized units became involved, bringing expertise in homicide investigation. Coordination between agencies increased, ensuring that information moved efficiently and securely. The investigation now required precision rather than speed alone. Community response changed as well. The realization that a crime had occurred replaced uncertainty with concern of a different nature. Public attention intensified, but law enforcement limited details to protect the investigation. Officials emphasized that confirmed information would be released when appropriate. Media coverage reflected the seriousness of the development. Reports shifted from search updates to investigative progress. Authorities avoided commentary that could compromise evidence or influence future proceedings. This restraint was deliberate. Investigators examined patterns and behaviors relevant to the time frame. They considered who had been present in the area, who had interacted with Christopher, and who might have had opportunity. This analysis relied on documented facts rather than assumption. The shift to a homicide investigation also introduced legal considerations. Warrants, forensic requests, and procedural safeguards became central. Every action required justification supported by evidence. This framework ensured that findings would withstand scrutiny. Throughout this period, investigators remained methodical. They did not rush to name suspects without sufficient basis. The focus stayed on building a case grounded in verifiable information. Each step was designed to reduce uncertainty rather than create narrative. The discovery marked a defining moment. It confirmed that Christopher Barrios Jr. was no longer simply missing. It established that a serious crime had occurred, and that responsibility existed somewhere within the evidence being gathered. This transition reshaped the investigation's purpose. The objective moved from recovery to accountability. The process became one of reconstruction, linking actions, movements, and evidence into a coherent sequence supported by fact. While answers were still incomplete, the direction was now clear. The investigation had entered a phase where evidence would guide every decision. The search for Christopher had become a search for truth rooted in forensic and procedural discipline. The impact of this moment extended beyond the investigation itself. It altered how the community understood the disappearance and how law enforcement approached every subsequent step. The shift was irreversible, defined not by speculation, but by what had been found and verified. From this point forward, the case would be shaped by evidence rather than uncertainty. The discovery closed one set of questions and opened another, more difficult set that demanded careful, deliberate work. As the investigation moved forward under a homicide classification, attention narrowed toward individuals whose proximity, actions, and histories aligned with the established timeline. Law enforcement focused on verifiable connections rather than assumption. Every step taken at this stage was grounded in documented evidence, procedural standards, and corroborated information. Investigators began by closely examining people who had been present in the area where Christopher Barrios Jr. had last been seen. This included reviewing known movements, daily routines, and any prior interactions with the child. Officers cross-referenced witness statements with physical evidence already collected, looking for consistency and contradiction. The goal was not speed, but accuracy. One individual quickly drew attention based on confirmed contact and circumstances that could be placed within the narrow window of time established earlier. This focus emerged through methodical elimination rather than accusation. Detectives verified timelines, checked alibis, and compared statements against independently obtained data. Discrepancies became apparent only after careful review. Law enforcement obtained search warrants supported by probable cause. These warrants allowed investigators to collect additional physical evidence from locations connected to the suspect. Each search followed strict legal protocols. Items recovered were cataloged and sent for forensic examination. The handling of evidence remained controlled, recognizing that later court proceedings would depend on proper procedure. Forensic results strengthened the investigative direction. Biological and trace evidence linked recovered items to Christopher Barrios Jr. These findings were not interpreted in isolation. They were evaluated alongside witness information, timelines, and the sequence of events reconstructed by investigators. The convergence of multiple independent factors provided the basis for further action. As evidence accumulated, investigators conducted formal interviews. These interviews were structured and documented. The focus remained on establishing facts rather than eliciting narratives. Statements were assessed for consistency with known information. Variations were noted and re-examined. The investigation also incorporated background review. Prior records and documented behavior were examined where legally relevant. This step was conducted carefully to avoid prejudice. The purpose was to contextualize evidence, not to replace it. Once sufficient evidence met the legal threshold, law enforcement proceeded with arrest. The arrest was executed according to standard procedure, ensuring the safety of all involved, and the preservation of rights. The individual was taken into custody without public spectacle. Authorities announced the arrest after it was completed and formally recorded. Public communication emphasized confirmed facts and avoided commentary beyond what evidence supported. Officials clarified that the arrest followed a structured investigation based on physical and corroborated information. The arrest marked a significant shift in the case. For the first time, the investigation moved from identifying what happened to identifying who was responsible. This transition carried legal weight and scrutiny. Every prior action was now subject to review through the lens of prosecution. Additional charges were filed as prosecutors reviewed the evidence. Indictments reflected the severity of the crime and the findings presented by investigators. Legal documents outlined the basis for charges, relying on documented evidence rather than interpretation. The community response was immediate and intense. Relief at progress existed alongside grief and anger. Law enforcement acknowledged the emotional impact while reiterating the importance of due process. Officials emphasized that arrest does not replace adjudication. The case would now proceed through the court system. Investigators continued working even after the arrest. Follow-up interviews, forensic confirmations, and record reviews were conducted to strengthen the case. The focus shifted toward preparing materials suitable for trial. This preparation required coordination between law enforcement and prosecutors. Throughout this stage, restraint remained central. Authorities avoided releasing unnecessary details that could influence potential jurors or compromise proceedings. Public updates were factual and limited to what had been officially filed. The arrest did not conclude the investigation, it advanced it. The burden of proof now rested on demonstrating responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. That process would unfold within the structure of the legal system, rather than through investigation alone. This stage underscored the importance of methodical work. The arrest was not the result of a single piece of evidence or a rushed conclusion. It reflected the convergence of timelines, forensic findings, and verified actions. For Christopher Barrios Jr., the arrest represented movement toward accountability. It did not undo the harm or answer every question. It marked the point where responsibility entered the legal arena. The investigation had moved from uncertainty to accusation supported by evidence. What followed would depend not on investigation alone, but on how that evidence was examined, challenged, and judged within the court system. Following the arrest, the case moved fully into the legal system. Investigators turned their work over to prosecutors, who began the process of evaluating evidence under the standards required for formal charges. Every detail gathered during the investigation was reviewed to determine how it fit within Georgia law and what could be proven in court. Prosecutors examined forensic findings, timelines, and documented actions connected to the suspect. The focus was not only on what evidence existed, but on how it had been obtained and preserved. Chain of custody, search warrants, and interview procedures were scrutinized to ensure that nothing would be excluded later. This stage required caution, as errors could weaken the entire case. An indictment was presented to a grand jury. The purpose of this step was to determine whether sufficient probable cause existed to proceed to trial. The grand jury reviewed evidence summaries and legal arguments prepared by the prosecution. After consideration, formal charges were issued related to the killing of Christopher Barrios Jr. The charges reflected the seriousness of the crime. Prosecutors alleged that the evidence supported intentional wrongdoing rather than accident or negligence. Legal filings outlined the basis for these conclusions, citing physical evidence, forensic analysis, and the established timeline of events. Each element of the charge required factual support. Once charges were filed, the case entered a new phase governed by court procedure. The accused was formally arraigned, and the legal process began to unfold according to statute. Defense counsel was appointed, and both sides prepared for a lengthy and complex proceeding. Pre-trial motions followed. Defense attorneys reviewed evidence and challenged aspects of the investigation where appropriate. These motions addressed issues such as admissibility, procedural compliance, and constitutional protections. Prosecutors responded by defending the integrity of their methods and the relevance of the evidence. During this period, the court addressed scheduling, evidence disclosure, and procedural matters. Hearings were held to resolve disputes before trial. The judge ruled on which materials could be presented to a jury and under what conditions. These decisions shaped how the case would ultimately be argued. The prosecution also considered sentencing options at this stage. Given the nature of the charges, capital punishment became a legal consideration. This determination required additional review and adherence to strict statutory requirements. Prosecutors evaluated aggravating factors outlined in Georgia law and assessed whether the case met the threshold for seeking the death penalty. The decision to pursue capital charges carried significant implications. It increased the complexity of the proceedings and heightened scrutiny of every action taken by the state. Additional safeguards were required to ensure fairness and compliance with constitutional standards. The defense prepared its strategy concurrently. This included examining investigative procedures, questioning forensic interpretations, and reviewing witness credibility. Defense filings sought to limit the scope of evidence and challenged the prosecution's narrative where possible. These actions were part of standard legal practice rather than indications of outcome. Public attention intensified as court filings became available. Media coverage focused on the seriousness of the charges and the potential penalties involved. Authorities remained restrained in public statements, emphasizing that the case would be decided through legal process rather than public opinion. The community followed developments closely. The shift from investigation to prosecution marked a new stage of accountability. At the same time, the legal system imposed limits on what could be disclosed. This balance aimed to protect the rights of the accused while honoring the gravity of the crime. Throughout this period, the court maintained control over proceedings. Judges ensured that deadlines were met and that both sides adhered to procedural rules. The structure of the legal system replaced investigative discretion with judicial oversight. Filing charges did not determine guilt. It established the framework through which guilt or innocence would be evaluated. Evidence that supported arrest now had to withstand adversarial testing in court. This stage underscored the difference between investigation and prosecution. Investigators seek facts. Prosecutors must present those facts within a legal framework that demands proof beyond reasonable doubt. The transition required precision and restraint. For the family of Christopher Barrios Jr., the movement toward trial represented progress, but not resolution. Legal proceedings are deliberate by design. They move at a pace dictated by law rather than emotion. The case now stood before the court, defined by indictments, motions, and legal argument. The outcome would depend not only on what investigators found, but on how that information was presented, challenged, and judged under the rules of justice. When the case entered the courtroom, the focus shifted from investigation to proof. The trial required that every claim be supported by admissible evidence and presented within the structure of law. What had been gathered over months of investigative work now faced examination under oath, governed by rules designed to test reliability, relevance, and fairness. Proceedings began with jury selection, a process intended to assemble a panel capable of evaluating evidence without bias. The court addressed procedural matters and set the framework for how testimony and exhibits would be introduced. From the outset, the emphasis was on method. The trial would not rely on narrative alone, but on demonstrable facts presented in sequence. The prosecution outlined the case it intended to prove, grounding its approach in physical evidence, forensic findings, and corroborated timelines. The objective was to demonstrate responsibility through a convergence of independent elements rather than a single assertion. Each component was introduced to build context and establish continuity. Investigators testified regarding the steps taken during the search and subsequent inquiry. Their testimony focused on actions taken, locations examined, and evidence recovered. This included documentation of how items were found, preserved, and transferred. Chain of custody was addressed to show that evidence presented in court matched what had been collected. Forensic specialists provided analysis related to physical findings. Their testimony explained laboratory procedures, testing methods, and results. The presentation avoided speculation and remained confined to what testing could support. The purpose was to connect evidence to verified facts rather than inference. Medical and forensic testimony addressed the determination of cause and manner of death. These findings were presented clinically without embellishment. The court required that conclusions be supported by accepted standards and peer-reviewed methods. This testimony established the basis for the homicide classification. Witnesses who had information relevant to timelines and movements were called. Their testimony aimed to situate events within a narrow window and confirm opportunity. Consistency between witness accounts and physical evidence was emphasized. Where inconsistencies existed, they were acknowledged and examined. The defense cross-examined witnesses to test accuracy and reliability. This included questioning investigative steps, forensic interpretations, and the handling of evidence. Such examination is a core function of trial procedure. It serves to expose weaknesses and ensure that conclusions are not assumed. Expert testimony was also subject to scrutiny. Defense questioning addressed methodology, margin of error, and alternative explanations where applicable. The court evaluated these exchanges to determine weight rather than certainty. The role of the jury was to assess credibility based on the totality of information. Throughout the trial, the judge ruled on objections and evidentiary matters. These rulings shaped what the jury could consider. Some materials were limited or excluded based on relevance or procedural grounds. These decisions reinforced the principle that not all information gathered during investigation meets the threshold for trial use. The prosecution continued to present evidence in a structured sequence. The goal was to demonstrate how independent findings aligned. Timelines were revisited, but only insofar as they were supported by testimony and records. The presentation avoided conjecture and remained anchored to documented facts. The defense presented its case by challenging interpretation rather than introducing alternative narratives unsupported by evidence. This approach focused on raising reasonable doubt through questioning the strength and connection of the prosecution's proof. The legal standard required the state to meet a high burden. The courtroom environment reflected the seriousness of the proceedings. Public access was maintained within legal limits. Media coverage was present but constrained by court rules. Reporting focused on testimony and rulings rather than commentary. As the trial progressed, jurors were instructed on their responsibilities. The court emphasized that decisions must be based solely on evidence presented and the law as explained. Emotional response was not a factor for consideration. This instruction is foundational to the trial process. Closing arguments summarized positions already supported by testimony. the prosecution reiterated how evidence connected and why it met the standard required for conviction. The defense emphasized gaps and questioned whether the burden had been satisfied. No new evidence was introduced at this stage. The judge provided formal instructions to the jury, outlining the elements required for each charge and the standard of proof. Jurors were directed to deliberate privately, weighing evidence without outside influence. Deliberations occurred away from public view. The length of deliberation reflected the seriousness of the charges and the volume of evidence considered. Jurors evaluated testimony, exhibits, and instructions before reaching conclusions. The trial represented the most rigorous examination of the case. Investigative findings were subjected to challenge, verification, and legal scrutiny. The process tested not only evidence, but the integrity of procedures that produced it. For the family and community, the trial marked a moment of confrontation with documented facts. It did not promise closure, it promised process. The outcome would reflect the jury's assessment of whether the evidence met the standard imposed by law. The courtroom proceedings transformed investigation into judgment. Responsibility would be determined not by assumption or sentiment, but by how convincingly evidence demonstrated guilt beyond reasonable doubt. After deliberations concluded, the jury returned its findings based on the evidence and instructions provided by the court. The verdict reflected the jury's assessment that the prosecution had met the required legal standard. Responsibility for the death of Christopher Barrios Jr. was established through the verdicts reached. The court recorded the decisions formally, marking the end of the trial phase and the transition to sentencing. The verdicts carried significant legal weight. They confirmed that the evidence presented, including forensic findings, timelines, and corroborated testimony, had been accepted as sufficient to prove the charges beyond reasonable doubt. The court acknowledged the outcome and proceeded according to statutory requirements governing serious felony convictions. Sentencing followed under procedures set by Georgia law. Given the nature of the crimes and the charges sustained, the court addressed applicable sentencing options. This stage required careful consideration of aggravating factors identified during trial and in pre-sentencing filings. The law outlines specific criteria for cases involving the killing of a child, and those criteria guided the court's actions. Prosecutors presented arguments related to sentencing that relied on the trial record and statutory factors. These arguments focused on the gravity of the offense and the circumstances established through evidence. Defense counsel presented counterarguments consistent with legal rights afforded at sentencing, addressing mitigation within the bounds of the record. The court evaluated submissions from both sides before issuing a sentence. Judicial findings were based on legal standards rather than emotion. The decision reflected the framework established by statute and precedent, ensuring that sentencing complied with constitutional and procedural requirements. The sentence imposed carried long-term consequences. It removed discretion from future proceedings except as allowed through appellate review. The outcome represented a formal determination by the justice system regarding punishment under law. Public response to the verdict and sentencing was immediate. For the community, the conclusion of trial proceedings marked an end to uncertainty about responsibility. At the same time, the seriousness of the sentence underscored the gravity of the crime and its lasting impact. Officials reiterated that the legal process had followed established procedure from investigation through trial and sentencing. Statements emphasized that verdicts were the result of evidence evaluated by a jury, rather than administrative decision. This distinction is central to the legitimacy of criminal proceedings. The sentencing phase also triggered the next stage of the legal process. Under law, convictions and sentences of this magnitude are subject to automatic review and appeal. These mechanisms exist to ensure that legal standards were applied correctly and that constitutional protections were observed throughout. For the family of Christopher Barrios Jr., the verdicts and sentencing represented accountability within the justice system. The proceedings did not restore what was lost. They established responsibility and consequence under law. The court closed the trial record and entered judgment. From that point forward, the case moved from trial court proceedings to post-conviction review. The transition did not alter the findings reached by the jury, but it opened a new legal path defined by appellate procedure. The verdicts also became part of the public record. They documented the outcome of a case that began as a missing child investigation and progressed through search, discovery, arrest, trial, and judgment. Each stage contributed to the final result recorded by the court. This moment marked the end of fact-finding through testimony and evidence presentation. Questions about guilt were resolved within the trial framework. Remaining legal questions would concern procedure, sentencing, and constitutional review, rather than factual determination. The sentencing outcome reflected the seriousness assigned by law to crimes involving children. It demonstrated how statutory structures guide punishment based on established criteria rather than discretionary judgment alone. With verdicts rendered and sentence imposed, the case entered a phase governed by appellate law. The trial court's role concluded, and higher courts would later examine aspects of the proceedings as required. The verdicts and sentencing did not close the broader conversation surrounding the case. They established legal resolution at the trial level, while leaving room for review through formal channels. The justice system moved forward according to its design, structured to balance finality with oversight. This stage confirmed accountability through lawful process. It marked a decisive point where investigation and trial yielded judgment under the standards imposed by law. After sentencing, the case moved into a stage governed by appellate law rather than trial procedure. Under Georgia statute, convictions involving capital punishment automatically receive higher court review. This process exists to examine whether legal standards were applied correctly and whether constitutional protections were preserved throughout investigation, trial, and sentencing. Appellate courts reviewed the record created in the trial court. This record included transcripts, evidentiary rulings, jury instructions, and sentencing findings. The focus was not on retrying facts, but on assessing whether errors occurred that could have affected the outcome. Legal arguments centered on procedure, interpretation of law, and application of precedent. Defense filings raised issues related to evidence admission, jury instructions, and sentencing determinations. These arguments were evaluated against established legal standards. The appellate process required judges to determine whether any identified issue met the threshold for reversal or modification. Not every procedural dispute qualifies as reversible error. Courts distinguish between harmless error and violations that undermine fairness. Prosecutors responded by defending the integrity of the trial process. Their submissions emphasized adherence to statutory requirements and prior case law. The state argued that evidence was properly admitted, that jurors were correctly instructed, and that sentencing followed legal guidelines. The Georgia Supreme Court issued rulings addressing these arguments. In its review, the court upheld the convictions and sentencing decisions. The ruling affirmed that the trial had been conducted within constitutional and statutory bounds. This decision maintained the legal outcome reached at trial. Subsequent proceedings continued through additional review mechanisms. Post-conviction filings addressed claims permitted under law, including ineffective assistance of counsel and procedural challenges. Each claim required specific factual and legal support. Courts reviewed these filings carefully, applying established standards rather than reconsidering factual guilt. Over time, aspects of sentencing were revisited as broader legal developments occurred. Changes in death penalty jurisprudence and procedural requirements prompted further review. Courts examined whether evolving standards affected the case. These reviews are part of a broader legal framework that ensures sentences remain compliant with current law. In later rulings, courts addressed the status of the death sentence. At one point, modifications removed the individual from death row. This change reflected legal determinations rather than factual reassessment. It did not overturn the conviction. It altered the form of punishment based on applicable legal standards at that time. Further legal action followed. Appeals and motions continued through the system as permitted. Eventually, higher court rulings reinstated the death sentence. This outcome reflected judicial findings that statutory requirements for capital punishment had been met and that prior modifications did not preclude reinstatement. These developments illustrate the complexity of capital case review. Sentencing in such cases is not static. It is subject to layered oversight, legal evolution, and constitutional interpretation. Each ruling is grounded in law rather than public opinion. Throughout appellate proceedings, courts issued written opinions explaining their reasoning. These documents provide transparency and allow scrutiny of judicial decision-making. They form part of the permanent public record and guide future cases. For the community, appellate rulings extended the timeline of resolution. While responsibility had been established at trial, finality remained delayed by necessary review. This extended process is a feature of the legal system rather than a failure. It reflects the weight assigned to irreversible penalties. Officials consistently emphasized that appellate review does not imply doubt about guilt. It serves to confirm that the process met required standards. This distinction is critical in understanding how the justice system balances accountability with protection of rights. The reinstatement of the death sentence marked a significant legal outcome. It reflected the culmination of multiple layers of review rather than a single decision. Each step followed defined procedure, even when outcomes changed over time. The appellate history of the case underscores the difference between factual determination and legal interpretation. Facts were established at trial. Appeals addressed how law was applied to those facts. This separation is fundamental to the structure of criminal justice. By the conclusion of appellate proceedings, the case stood with convictions affirmed and sentencing determined by the highest courts involved. The legal process had exercised its full scope of review. This stage demonstrates how accountability in serious cases is reinforced through oversight rather than speed. The extended review did not reopen investigation. It tested the strength and fairness of the process that led to judgment. The case remained defined by its legal record. Decisions were made through written rulings, legal standards, and constitutional analysis. The outcome reflected not only the severity of the crime, but the structured path required to reach and confirm such judgments under law. The legal process surrounding the death of Christopher Barrios Jr. reached its conclusion through formal judgment and extended review. But the broader impact of the case extends beyond court rulings. Accountability was established through conviction and sentencing, yet the consequences of the crime and the response to it continued to shape the community and inform public discussion. For Brunswick, the case altered perceptions of safety and trust. A child disappeared from a familiar environment, and the events that followed challenged assumptions about proximity and risk. The investigation revealed how quickly routine circumstances can turn into crisis and how critical early response is in protecting vulnerable individuals. Law enforcement agencies reviewed their procedures in light of the case. Early search coordination, evidence handling, and interagency communication became points of reflection. While the investigation ultimately led to accountability, the case highlighted how early uncertainty places pressure on decision-making and resource deployment. The legal proceedings demonstrated the structure and limits of the justice system. Investigation, prosecution, trial, and appeal each served a defined role. Responsibility was determined through evidence tested under adversarial conditions, rather than narrative or assumption. This process is deliberate by design, prioritizing accuracy and rights over speed. The appellate phase reinforced the importance of oversight in cases involving severe penalties. Multiple layers of review examined whether procedures met constitutional and statutory standards. While this extended the timeline, it underscored the principle that final judgments must withstand scrutiny. The outcome reflected both accountability and restraint. For the family of Christopher Barrios Jr., the legal resolution established responsibility under law. It did not erase loss. Courts address culpability, not restoration. The distinction between legal accountability and personal healing remains significant. The case also contributed to broader awareness regarding crimes against children. It reinforced the need for vigilance, timely reporting, and coordinated response. Public education efforts often reference such cases to emphasize prevention and early intervention. Media coverage evolved over time, moving from urgent reporting to analysis of legal outcomes. Responsible reporting focused on verified facts rather than speculation. This approach supported public understanding without compromising process. Systemic lessons emerge from the case. Early assumptions can shape investigative paths. Evidence preservation is essential for later accountability. Legal safeguards ensure fairness, even when outcomes provoke strong emotion. Each element contributes to the integrity of the system as a whole. The case stands as an example of how accountability is achieved through sustained effort rather than singular action. No single moment resolved it. Progress resulted from cumulative steps taken by investigators, prosecutors, courts, and review bodies. While the legal chapter closed, the case remains part of the public record. It informs training, policy discussion, and community awareness. Such cases shape how future responses are designed and evaluated. The final outcome reflects the justice system functioning as intended within its limits. It delivered judgment based on evidence and law. It allowed review where required. It recorded responsibility formally and transparently. Christopher Barrios Jr. is remembered not as a case number, but as a child whose disappearance led to scrutiny, action, and legal consequence. The record preserves what is known and acknowledges what cannot be undone. The lasting lesson is not found in punishment alone. It lies in understanding how systems respond to vulnerability, how evidence becomes accountability, and how careful process remains essential even under intense pressure. The case concludes with accountability established and lessons carried forward. It remains a reminder that justice is a process measured not only by outcomes, but by how faithfully facts, law, and responsibility are applied from start to finish.